Billionaire's wife spilled wine on a black CEO. Seconds later, her dynasty collapsed. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. You think you're equal? The words cut through the ballroom like shattered crystal skidding across marble. Laughter followed, sharp, confident, rehearsed, rolling outward from a woman in a champagne-colored gown as flawless as the room itself. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their light bouncing off polished tables, silk dresses, and the mirrored smiles of people who believed this night belonged to them. Across the room stood the man they were laughing at. He was tall, composed, dressed in a tailored beige suit that refused to shout for attention. No jewelry. No entourage. A phone pressed to his ear, his gaze steady, distant, as if the noise around him belonged to another world. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He looked occupied. The woman took a step closer, heels clicking like punctuation marks. Her friends leaned in, delighted. Cameras rose. Someone whispered, "Oh, this is good," as if cruelty were entertainment scheduled between courses. Honestly, the woman continued, her voice sweetened with contempt, "I don't know who let you in here. These events are selective." She lifted her glass. The red wine tipped, slow and deliberate, splashing across the edge of the white tablecloth, streaking toward the man's jacket, staining the space between them like a declaration. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed immediately by laughter, louder this time. Approval laughter. The kind that reassures the bully she's safe. The man didn't move. Wine dripped from the linen to the marble floor, each drop echoing in a room that suddenly felt colder. He lowered his phone slightly, listening to the voice on the other end, eyes never leaving the woman now basking in her audience. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Marcus. Around him, the room rearranged itself. Men in tuxedos smirked behind raised glasses. Women in jewel-toned gowns leaned together, whispering verdicts. No one intervened. No one asked if he was all right. Silence would have required courage, and courage was not on the menu tonight. You should be grateful, the woman said, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate. Some people spend their whole lives trying to get this close to our world. Our world. Marcus finally ended the call. He slipped the phone into his pocket with measured calm, as if completing a thought. His expression didn't change, but the air around him did. It tightened. The laughter thinned, uncertain now, like applause that had started too early. He looked around, not at the woman, but at the room. At the chandeliers. At the tables funded by inherited money. At the faces lit by confidence borrowed from last names. He had seen rooms like this before. Built some of them. Owned more than a few. The woman mistook his silence for surrender. She smiled wider, emboldened. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm sure someone will show you the way out." A man nearby chuckled. Another lifted his phone higher, framing the shot. Somewhere, a violin faltered mid-note. Marcus adjusted his cuff, smooth and unhurried. He met the woman's eyes for the first time. There was no heat there. No plea. Just clarity. He spoke softly. One sentence. Low enough that only those nearest heard it. "Cancel it." Effective immediately. That was all. No announcement. No explanation. Just a decision set loose in the world. The woman laughed again, unaware. The room exhaled, thinking the moment had passed. Wine was replaced. Music resumed. Smiles returned to their assigned places. They had no idea that, in that exact second, something ancient had cracked. Not glass. Not linen. A dynasty. The laughter lingered after Marcus spoke, floating above the tables like perfume that hadn't yet faded. People shifted in their seats, relieved to return to comfort. To them, it was over. A small scene. An awkward moment smoothed away by champagne and music. They didn't understand what kind of man remained standing in front of them. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't reclaim the room. He simply stood there, still, as if time had slowed to match his breathing. The stain on the tablecloth wasn't what held his attention. It was the pattern he'd seen his entire life: how easily people mistook silence for weakness, restraint for permission. He had learned that lesson early. Years before the chandeliers and the tailored suits, Marcus had learned how to listen while others talked themselves into mistakes. He learned how rooms worked: who spoke first, who spoke loudest, and who quietly decided everything after the noise faded. Tonight was no different. This room just had better lighting. Across the table, the woman who had spilled the wine leaned back, satisfied. Her name carried weight here. Her laugh signaled safety. People followed her cues without thinking, the way they always had. To her, Marcus was a prop in a brief moment of amusement, nothing more. She didn't notice his eyes move, calmly cataloging the room. The exits. The cameras. The people pretending not to watch. He noticed everything. He always did. Someone nearby whispered his name incorrectly. Another guessed his profession wrong. A third assumed he was new money, whatever that meant to them. Marcus didn't correct anyone. He had long since stopped doing that. Power didn't need introductions. It needed timing. A server approached, hesitant, eyes darting between Marcus and the woman in the champagne gown. "Sir, would you like another drink?" she asked, her voice careful. "No," Marcus replied gently. "Thank you." That was all it took for the server to retreat, relieved. No scene. No tension added. Just a quiet boundary set and respected. The contrast didn't go unnoticed by a few in the room. A man near the far table frowned, studying Marcus more closely now. A woman beside him lowered her phone, uncertain. The music swelled again, but it sounded thinner, stretched. The orchestra played through smiles that no longer reached the eyes. Conversations restarted, but they carried an edge, as if everyone sensed something unfinished hanging in the air. Marcus glanced down at his watch. Not impatient. Precise. What no one in that ballroom knew was that the call he had just ended wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactionary. It was procedural. Marcus didn't make decisions to feel better. He made them to close loops. The woman who had humiliated him laughed again, louder than necessary. She raised her glass in a mock toast toward another table. Applause followed. She was still the sun here, still certain the world revolved exactly as it always had. But gravity had already shifted. Marcus stepped slightly away from the table, creating space without announcing it. A few heads turned instinctively. Authority has a way of doing that, drawing attention even when it doesn't ask for it. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. He was repositioning. His phone vibrated once in his pocket. He didn't check it. He already knew what it meant. Across the room, a man in a dark suit leaned toward his companion and murmured, "Who is that?" The companion shook his head, uneasy. "No idea," he replied. "But something about him feels off." Marcus allowed himself the faintest exhale. Not satisfaction. Alignment. He looked once more at the woman in the champagne gown, still basking in borrowed applause, unaware that the rules she thought protected her had just been rewritten. He didn't hate her. Hate required energy. He preferred outcomes. In rooms like this, people believed power announced itself with speeches, with names, with displays. Marcus knew better. Real power moved quietly, like a current beneath polished floors. And it was already moving. The night wasn't over. It was only beginning to understand who it had underestimated. Her name was Evelyn Hartwell, and in rooms like this, that was supposed to mean something. It meant lineage. It meant protection. It meant that mistakes bent around her instead of landing. Evelyn had grown up learning that her voice carried weight long before it carried meaning. Doors opened when she approached. People laughed when she paused. Silence followed when she raised a brow. Tonight was no different, at least, that's what she believed. She stood with the ease of someone who had never been challenged in public. The wine glass rested lightly between her fingers, the stem balanced like an extension of her authority. Around her, the room responded on instinct. Smiles angled toward her. Bodies leaned in. Approval flowed without being asked for. She mistook attention for control. Evelyn hadn't spilled the wine by accident. Accidents were beneath her. This was a correction, a reminder, delivered theatrically, of where she believed the hierarchy stood. She had sensed Marcus's presence the moment she saw him. Not because he looked out of place, but because he didn't look impressed. Men like him irritated her. Quiet ones. The kind who didn't rush to explain themselves. The kind who didn't shrink when scrutinized. In her world, visibility was currency, and anyone who refused to perform felt like a challenge. So she created a moment. And the room rewarded her for it. Now, basking in the aftermath, Evelyn accepted the laughter like applause after a well-executed scene. She turned slightly, offering her profile to the nearest cameras, already editing the story in her mind. A harmless incident. A misunderstanding. A man who didn't belong learning his place. Her husband's name echoed faintly in conversation nearby. That reassured her. It always did. The empire stood behind her, vast and unquestioned. Banks answered his calls. Boards waited for his nod. This gala itself existed because of their generosity, or so the plaque at the entrance claimed. Evelyn had never needed to understand the machinery. She only needed to trust that it worked for her. She glanced at Marcus again, expecting to find him retreating. Instead, she found him exactly where he had been, calm, distant, untouched by the spectacle. Something about that unsettled her. She masked it quickly, lifting her glass again, laughing a beat too loud. Confidence, when forced, makes noise. Honestly, she said to the woman beside her, some people mistake access for importance. The woman nodded, eager, but her eyes flicked back toward Marcus, uncertain. Evelyn followed her gaze, irritation tightening behind her smile. He wasn't supposed to still be here. He wasn't supposed to look like the moment hadn't affected him. Moments like this were meant to diminish. That was their purpose. She leaned toward a man across the table, lowering her voice. Do you know who he is? The man hesitated. Not really, he admitted. But he doesn't seem lost. Evelyn laughed softly. Confidence is easy when you have nothing to lose. She believed that. What she didn't see was how the room had begun to subtly reorient. How a few conversations had paused mid-sentence. How a handful of people were no longer watching her, but watching him. The shift was quiet, almost imperceptible. But it was there. Evelyn took another sip of wine, savoring the taste of certainty. She had no reason to doubt herself. The rules had always favored her. They always would. She had no idea that the very structure she relied on, the deals, the signatures, the unseen agreements, was already slipping beyond her reach. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn Hartwell stood at the center of a room where the power she trusted was no longer responding. She just didn't know it yet. The room adjusted the way crowds always do when they sense risk quietly, instinctively, without admitting it. Laughter softened first. Not all at once, but unevenly, like lights dimming section by section. A few guests glanced at one another, searching for cues. Others took refuge in their glasses, suddenly very interested in the color of the wine, the cut of the crystal, anything but the man still standing near the table. Phones remained raised, but hands tightened. Recording felt different now. Less like entertainment. More like evidence. The crowd had laughed when Evelyn spilled the wine. That had felt safe. That had felt aligned with the unspoken rules of the room. But safety depended on consensus, and consensus was beginning to fracture. Near the back, a pair of investors leaned together. "Something's off," one murmured. "She pushed too far." The other shrugged, unwilling to commit. "Maybe. But she's a Hartwell." The name still carried weight. Just not the kind it used to. A woman in a navy gown lowered her phone, frowning at the screen. She hadn't captured what she wanted: the satisfying collapse, the visible shame. Instead, she had recorded stillness. A man who refused to perform humiliation on cue. That made the clip harder to frame. Across the room, a server paused mid-step, uncertain whether to continue. Two security guards exchanged a glance. No one had told them to act, but they felt the tension pulling at the room, stretching it thin. This was the moment crowds hate most. The moment when they realize they might have chosen the wrong side too quickly. Marcus remained where he was, neither retreating nor advancing. His presence had become an anchor, unmoving, unyielding. People began to orient around it without realizing why. Conversations drifted closer, then stalled. Eyes returned to him again and again, drawn by the absence of reaction. Someone whispered, "He's not embarrassed." Another replied, quieter, "No. He's waiting." That unsettled them. Evelyn still commanded attention, but it was no longer effortless. She had to speak to keep it. She laughed to remind the room who she was. Each sound felt slightly delayed, like applause out of sync with the performance. The crowd noticed. They always do. A man near the bar checked his phone, his brow furrowing. He typed quickly, then looked up at Marcus, then back down again. Whatever he saw didn't reassure him. He leaned toward his wife and murmured something that made her straighten in her seat. Ripples spread. Small, contained, but unmistakable. This was how power shifts in rooms like this, not with confrontation, but with recalibration. People began preparing their exit strategies. Emotional ones first. Physical ones later. The crowd had laughed because it was easy. Because it cost nothing. But now, laughter felt like a liability. Association, a risk. They didn't yet know what had been set in motion. They only knew the air had changed, and they hadn't been told why. And in that uncertainty, loyalty wavered. Somewhere between the chandeliers and the marble floor, the crowd began to understand a dangerous truth: moments of cruelty don't disappear. They settle. They wait. And when consequences arrive, they don't ask who meant it as a joke. They only ask who was watching and who joined in. By the time the orchestra reached the end of its piece, the room was no longer united. It was divided. And everyone could feel it. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic turn of heads. The orchestra continued. Glasses clinked. Evelyn laughed again, relieved that the room seemed to be drifting back into alignment. For a moment, she believed the incident had passed. Marcus knew better. He stood slightly apart now, close enough to be seen, far enough to be left alone. That distance mattered. It always did. Power required space to move. His phone vibrated again. This time, he took it out. The screen lit briefly, one name, no subject line. He didn't read further. He didn't need to. People assumed important decisions came after long deliberation, raised voices, heated debate. In reality, the most consequential choices were often confirmations, not discussions. Marcus stepped toward the edge of the room, where the music thinned and conversations lost their confidence. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. Authority has a way of granting passage even before it's recognized. He lifted the phone to his ear. "Yes," he said calmly. On the other end, a voice spoke quickly, efficiently. "Numbers. Timelines. Exposure." Marcus listened without interrupting, eyes resting on the far wall where a projection cycled through sponsors' names. Familiar names. Familiar structures. All of them interconnected. He glanced once at his watch. "Proceed," he said. Then, after a brief pause, added, "Effective immediately." That was the entire call. He ended it before the voice could respond, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and turned around. Nothing in the room reacted. Not yet. Evelyn was mid-conversation, her glass raised, her posture relaxed again. She had reclaimed her orbit. Laughter rippled on cue. Someone toasted to partnerships. Another to legacy. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Marcus walked back toward the table, not with urgency, not with hesitation. With intent. A man noticed him first. Then another. Conversation stuttered. Eyes followed. No one knew why they were watching, only that something compelled them to. Marcus stopped where he had stood before. The wine stain was still visible, dark against the white cloth. He looked at it briefly, then away. That detail was finished. It had served its purpose. Across the table, Evelyn met his gaze again. For the first time, her smile didn't arrive immediately. A flicker of irritation crossed her face instead. She masked it quickly, but it lingered behind her eyes. "You're still here," she said lightly, as if surprised. Marcus nodded once. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her. She laughed it off, turning to someone beside her. "See? No hard feelings," she said. "These things get blown out of proportion." Marcus said nothing. Around them, the room leaned in, not physically, but perceptually. Attention narrowed. Even the orchestra softened, as if sensing a cue it hadn't been given. Evelyn shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on them. She had been certain control would return the moment she decided it should. That had always been how it worked. But control, once lost, doesn't come back on command. Marcus adjusted his jacket, smooth and unhurried. There was no triumph in his expression. No satisfaction. Only resolve. What he had set in motion no longer required his presence to unfold. Across the room, a phone buzzed. Then another. A man frowned at his screen. A woman's smile froze halfway into place. Someone stood abruptly, whispering into the air as if it might answer back. The room didn't know it yet, but the call Marcus had just made had already passed the point of reversal. Contracts were being paused. Commitments withdrawn. Assumptions challenged. The collapse hadn't arrived. But it was on its way. What the room didn't know, what Evelyn Hartwell had never needed to know, was how fragile her world had become long before the wine ever touched the tablecloth. The Hartwell name still opened doors, but behind those doors, the math no longer worked the way it used to. Their empire looked solid from the outside: real estate portfolios, private equity stakes, legacy holdings passed down like heirlooms, but inside, it was strained. Over-leveraged. Dependent on confidence more than capital. And confidence, once questioned, collapses fast. Evelyn's husband had spent the last 18 months chasing stability with increasing urgency. Quiet meetings. Delicate negotiations. Lines of credit renewed not because the numbers were strong, but because the name still carried weight. The gala tonight wasn't just social. It was strategic. It was meant to seal a future. The partnership they were courting had been discussed in hushed rooms, handled through intermediaries who never showed faces. Lawyers spoke to lawyers. Advisors spoke to advisors. The principal remained intentionally distant, an invisible counterweight whose involvement reassured banks and unsettled competitors. That principal was Marcus. He had never needed to attend tonight. He chose to. Not for recognition. Not for leverage. But because at some point, you have to look people in the eye before you decide whether they deserve proximity to what you've built. Evelyn had no idea. She had never asked who the deal depended on. In her world, outcomes were assumed. The machinery of power was something she trusted blindly, the way people trust elevators without thinking about cables. Marcus had been watching those cables for years. He knew exactly how exposed the Hartwell structure was. He knew which assets were propping up which debts. Which promises were backed by paper instead of liquidity. He also knew how quickly trust evaporated when the wrong signal was sent. That was the signal he had just sent. Across the room, the first cracks were already forming. A senior advisor leaned into a phone call, his voice low, controlled, but urgent. A board member excused herself from the table, her smile fixed in place as she moved toward the exit. These were not coincidences. These were reactions. Marcus didn't need to watch them. He had already moved on. Evelyn noticed the movement, though she didn't understand it. A flicker of irritation crossed her face as she realized conversations were no longer orbiting her. Attention had shifted, and she didn't know why. She leaned toward her husband, whispering something sharp. He nodded absently, eyes on his phone now, his jaw tightening with each passing second. He hadn't looked at Marcus once. Not yet. That, too, would change. Marcus stood quietly, hands relaxed at his sides, as if nothing of consequence were happening. To an untrained eye, he looked disengaged. To those who understood power, he looked finished. Finished deciding. In rooms like this, people believe dominance is loud. That it announces itself, demands acknowledgement. Marcus had learned the opposite. Real authority operates without spectacle. It creates outcomes and lets others discover them too late. Evelyn lifted her glass again, searching for laughter, for reassurance. It came thin, delayed, uncertain. For the first time that night, she felt it. Not fear. Instability. And somewhere beneath the chandeliers, beneath the practiced smiles and polished marble, the truth settled into place. The future she assumed was guaranteed had just been placed in someone else's hands. Someone she had dismissed. Someone she had humiliated. Someone who was already walking away from the deal that kept her world intact. The collapse didn't arrive with noise. It began with absence. Across the ballroom, a man stared at his phone longer than necessary. His brow creased, the practiced calm slipping for just a second before he masked it. He typed a reply, stopped, deleted it, then stood and excused himself from the table without explanation. Another guest followed. Then another. Conversations thinned. Laughter fractured mid-sentence. The orchestra continued to play, but the music felt ornamental now, something layered over a reality that was quietly changing beneath everyone's feet. Evelyn noticed first because she was used to being noticed. She felt the attention sliding away from her like silk slipping off a shoulder. She turned, scanning the room, searching for confirmation that she still held it. She didn't. Her husband's phone buzzed again. He checked it this time. His face didn't drain of color. That would have been dramatic. Instead, it tightened subtly, decisively. The expression of a man recognizing a problem he could no longer outrun. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, leaning close, her voice sharp. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked toward the far side of the room, toward Marcus, then back to the screen. Whatever he was reading didn't require interpretation. "It's complicated," he said finally. That was a lie. Complicated was something you could manage. This was final. Across the room, two advisors spoke in low tones, shoulders angled away from the tables. One shook his head slowly. The other exhaled through his nose, already calculating damage control. Their body language told a story before words ever would. A woman near the bar laughed too loudly, then stopped, sensing the shift. Her smile lingered, unsupported. She set her glass down untouched. Phones continued to buzz, not all at once, but enough to create a pattern. Each vibration carried the same message in different forms. Withdrawn. Paused. Reconsidered. Effective immediately. Marcus remained where he was, no longer the center of attention, no longer the object of ridicule. He had moved beyond the room entirely. What mattered now was unfolding elsewhere: boardrooms, inboxes, call logs lighting up in rapid succession. Evelyn rose halfway from her seat, instinctively, as if standing might restore something she had lost. It didn't. The room didn't respond. No one turned toward her. She looked at her husband again, urgency breaking through her composure. "Call them," she whispered. "This is a misunderstanding." He swallowed. "They're not answering." That was the moment it became real. The gala hadn't changed. The chandeliers still burned bright. The tables were still set. But the illusion that protected Evelyn Hartwell of permanence, of untouchable status, had cracked. Not because of what she had done, but because of who she had done it to. And the empire she believed would always catch her when she fell had already stepped aside. Evelyn Hartwell had always believed realization arrived loudly. A gasp. A confrontation. A dramatic turning point where the room froze and everyone finally understood who held power. This was quieter. She stood there, half risen from her chair, one hand resting on the table as if it might steady her. Her gaze moved from face to face, searching for familiarity, for reassurance, for the reflexive deference she had spent her life collecting. It wasn't there. People avoided her eyes now. Some pretended to be absorbed in their phones. Others leaned into conversations that no longer included her. A few had already turned away entirely, bodies angled toward exits, toward safer associations. Evelyn felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not humiliation. Exposure. She followed the invisible line of attention that had shifted across the room and found Marcus again. He wasn't watching her. That was the most unsettling part. He stood calmly, detached, already past the moment she was only beginning to understand. A man near her whispered a name under his breath. Not hers. His. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She turned sharply to her husband. "Who is he?" she demanded, keeping her voice low, controlled. Her husband hesitated a fraction too long. "That's Marcus Hale," he said finally. "He's involved." "Involved how?" she pressed. He didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes refused to meet hers, told her everything she hadn't wanted to hear. The realization landed with precision. The deal. The one they had been waiting on. The one holding their finances together, keeping lenders patient and partners calm. The one everyone had treated like a formality. It depended on him. Evelyn's breath caught. She looked back at Marcus, really looked at him this time, not as a stranger, not as an inconvenience, but as a variable she had catastrophically misjudged. The memory replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. Her laughter. The raised glass. The wine spilling where it shouldn't have. The room's approval. She felt suddenly, painfully aware of how many people had witnessed it. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. It wasn't a moment that could be reframed. She had drawn a line publicly and stepped on the wrong side of it. Her husband's phone buzzed again. He checked it, then looked up at her with an expression she had never seen before. Defeat. "They're pulling back," he said quietly. "All of them." Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed again. Words failed her not because she didn't have them, but because none of them applied anymore. Across the room, Marcus shifted, preparing to leave. Not dramatically. Not for effect. Simply because he was done. That was when Evelyn understood the full weight of what she had done. She hadn't embarrassed a man. She had dismissed authority. And authority, once dismissed, doesn't argue. It withdraws. And takes everything with it. Marcus didn't wait for permission to leave. He stepped away from the table with the same quiet precision he'd carried all night, his movements unhurried, his posture unchanged. No announcement followed him. No one tried to stop him. The room seemed to understand, instinctively, that this was not an exit meant to be acknowledged. A few heads turned anyway. Some out of curiosity. Others out of belated respect. Evelyn watched him go. For a moment, she considered calling out. Saying something, anything that might soften the reality closing in around her. An apology. An explanation. A justification dressed as grace. But the words never formed. She knew, now, how empty they would sound. Apologies are requests for mercy. Marcus had already chosen consequence. Near the entrance, he paused just long enough to accept his coat from a staff member who suddenly seemed very aware of who he was serving. Marcus thanked him quietly. The man nodded, almost reverent, as if he'd missed the moment he was supposed to recognize authority and was determined not to miss another. The doors closed behind Marcus without ceremony. Inside, the room tried to recover. Someone suggested dessert. Another called for more wine. The orchestra restarted with determination, as if volume could drown out what everyone felt but refused to name. Laughter returned in fragments, brittle and misplaced. Evelyn remained standing. Her husband leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll fix this," he said, though neither of them believed it. "We just need time." Time was the one thing they no longer had. By morning, the fallout would be public. Press releases framed carefully but read between the lines. Partners distancing themselves strategically. Lenders reassessing exposure. The Hartwell name appearing in conversations it had once controlled now as a warning, not an assurance. The dynasty wouldn't fall in one dramatic collapse. It would erode. Quietly. Methodically. Exactly the way Marcus had built his power. Evelyn sat down slowly, the weight of the room pressing in on her. Around her, people resumed talking, but their voices passed through her without landing. She had never felt smaller in a space designed to make her feel untouchable. Outside, Marcus stepped into the night air and exhaled. Not in relief. In completion. He didn't feel victorious. He felt aligned. The decision he'd made matched the values he carried, the boundaries he refused to negotiate. Dignity had not required a speech. Justice had not required spectacle. Power, exercised correctly, rarely does. As his car pulled away, the gala continued behind him unchanged in appearance, irrevocably altered in truth. Chandeliers still glowed. Glasses still clinked. But something essential had left the room. Respect. And without it, no empire lasts.